That did it for Robert Shaw. That was, I think, the beginning of the great Dreyfuss-Shaw feud.
Shaw was a troublemaker. Shaw was an instigator.
What happens when a Hollywood legend and a classically trained actor are trapped on a boat and they hate each other? For decades, fans believed Richard Dreyfuss and his Jaws co-star were locked in a bitter feud during filming. But as new stories surface, that rivalry might not be what it seemed. Some say it was all an act. Others say it nearly sank the film. So what really happened between Dreyfuss and the man who played Quint? When Universal greenlit Jaws, nobody expected it would become one of the most iconic thrillers in cinema history. And certainly, no one predicted that the real drama would happen off-camera. At the center of that storm were two actors, Robert Shaw, the hardened British veteran with a Shakespearean pedigree, and Richard Dreyfuss, a rising American star whose sharp wit and nervous energy made him the perfect counterbalance. But while their characters formed a fragile alliance on screen, their relationship behind the scenes was anything but smooth. Robert Shaw was already well known in British theatre and had earned praise for intense, often brooding roles. He brought gravitas and baggage to the set. Shaw was known to be difficult, especially when drinking, which he often did during production. His portrayal of Quint, the salty shark hunter, was made all the more authentic by the actor's unpredictable nature. He could be charming one moment, vicious the next. The crew called him brilliant. They also called him volatile. Then came Richard Dreyfuss. At only 26, he was considerably younger than Shaw, eager to prove himself, and already on edge about joining a project that felt like a gamble. The mechanical shark was not working. Filming was running late. The ocean was unforgiving. The last thing Dreyfuss needed was to clash with a co-star, but that is exactly what happened. The tension between the two men started small. Dreyfuss found Shaw's method acting annoying. Shaw, in turn, saw Dreyfuss as arrogant and ungrateful. Shaw was from a generation that valued tradition, stage discipline, and hard-won roles. Dreyfuss represented something newer, improvised, casual, and fast-rising. The clash was generational, stylistic, and deeply personal. One day, it exploded. According to crew members, Shaw challenged Dreyfuss constantly. He mocked his acting. He taunted him between takes. At one point, he even dared Dreyfuss to climb the ship's mast and jump off. A dare the young actor took just to shut Shaw up. It became clear this was more than standard artistic tension. It was a Cold War, fought with barbs and silent glares, that everyone on set felt. And yet, for some strange reason, that conflict fed their scenes. Their characters were meant to be wary of each other. That barely contained edge? It was not just acting, it was real. But the full story behind their feud was far more complicated, and not everyone agrees on what actually happened. The feud between Richard Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw was not just a matter of clashing personalities, it became something more cinematic than the film itself. Over time, stories from the Jaws set grew larger than life, twisted by memory, media, and mythology. But some moments, confirmed by those who were there, remain unforgettable and almost unbelievable. One of the most retold tales involves a bottle of bourbon. Robert Shaw, already deep into character and possibly deeper into his drink, allegedly offered Dreyfuss a sip of bourbon between takes. Dreyfuss refused. Shaw, already irritable, reportedly goaded him in front of the crew, daring him to prove his manhood by taking a swig. When Dreyfuss responded by snatching the bottle and hurling it overboard, Shaw lost it. To Shaw, it was not just a bottle, it was a challenge to his authority, his pride, and maybe even his masculinity. The tension only escalated from there. Crew members recall Dreyfuss retaliating in strange, unexpected ways. In one version of the story, he used a fire hose on Shaw, spraying him without warning. Whether it was meant as a prank, payback, or an outright act of defiance, the message was clear. This was not a minor disagreement. It was open warfare. These clashes were not isolated events. Day after day, verbal sparring continued between takes. Shaw would loudly critique Dreyfuss's performance, mock his age, and question his talent. Dreyfuss, for his part, grew more agitated, more defensive, and yet neither actor walked away. Both remained locked in the production, unable to quit, unable to escape. Director Steven Spielberg later confessed the feud made him nervous. He was still early in his career and managing a film that was already over budget, plagued by technical issues, and nearly shut down multiple times. The last thing he needed was a full-blown meltdown between two of his leads. But, strangely enough, Spielberg never stepped in to stop it. Some say he even used the animosity to his advantage. It worked. On screen, the tension between Quint and Hooper is electric. Every glare, every insult, every awkward silence has a rawness that could never have been rehearsed. And perhaps it never was. Because behind the lens, Shaw and Dreyfuss were engaged in their own psychological tug-of-war, one that pulled the entire cast and crew into its orbit. But was it real hatred or something more complicated? For decades, the supposed feud between Richard Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw lived on in Hollywood lore like a ghost story, told with confidence, repeated with flair, but never quite confirmed. Then, years later, Dreyfuss finally began speaking openly about it. But instead of clearing the air, his version of events only added more fuel to the fire. In several interviews, including one with Turner Classic Movies, Dreyfuss firmly stated, "There was no feud. I loved him." He described Shaw not as a bitter rival, but as a brilliant, damaged man, someone whose brilliance came with heavy emotional baggage. According to Dreyfuss, Shaw's drinking was more of a personal battle than an act of hostility. He suggested that Shaw was often hard on himself and took that out on others, not out of malice, but because of his own inner torment. But not everyone buys that explanation. While Dreyfuss now downplays the feud, others who were there remember things differently. Director Steven Spielberg once admitted he had to keep the two actors apart between takes because of the escalating tension. Crew members described the atmosphere as toxic at times, with Shaw constantly undermining Dreyfuss, challenging him, belittling him. Even Shaw's own son, Ian Shaw, who later co-wrote and starred in the stage play The Shark is Broken, acknowledged that his father could be cruel toward Dreyfuss, and that the younger actor often took the brunt of his father's volatility. The play itself dramatizes these clashes. It paints Shaw as a tortured, lonely genius, someone aware of his own mortality and bitterness over Dreyfuss's youth and success. One scene even depicts Shaw mocking Dreyfuss for being insecure, poking at him for his weight, and questioning his acting chops. The tension is real, sharp, and uncomfortable, and the play, built from Ian's own memories and research, suggests there was more truth to the feud than Dreyfuss would like people to believe. So why deny it? Some say Dreyfuss wants to protect Shaw's legacy. Others believe he is simply tired of being defined by an old rivalry, especially one that has overshadowed other aspects of his career. After all, Dreyfuss went on to win an Academy Award for The Goodbye Girl just 2 years after Jaws. Shaw, on the other hand, died tragically young in 1978, just 3 years after the film's release. Whatever the reason, Dreyfuss's revised version of events does not match the accounts of others. And that gap, the difference between memory and mythology, is where this story refuses to settle. Because every time Dreyfuss insists the feud was overblown, someone else comes forward with a story that says otherwise. Long after the cameras stopped rolling and the salt spray settled, the story of the Jaws feud only seemed to grow stronger. It survived not just in whispers and behind-the-scenes books, but in interviews, late-night television anecdotes, and fan theories. Even as Richard Dreyfuss repeatedly tried to downplay the drama, the legend of the conflict between him and Robert Shaw had taken on a life of its own, bigger than the shark, bigger than the movie, and maybe even bigger than the truth. So why did this particular feud become so unforgettable? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the production itself. Jaws was a film born in chaos. The mechanical shark, famously named Bruce, barely functioned. Shooting on open water led to endless delays and ballooning costs. Director Steven Spielberg was young, ambitious, and often terrified the entire film would collapse under the weight of its problems. In the midst of all this pressure, every moment of tension on set, especially between two lead actors, felt magnified. Shaw and Dreyfuss's clashing personalities became a kind of emotional lightning rod for the crew. Their real-life friction mirrored the script's core conflict: seasoned veteran versus bright-eyed scientist, instinct versus intellect. The line between character and actor blurred, and what happened on screen began to reflect what was happening off it. This made the feud not just entertaining gossip, it made it feel essential to the film's success. Then came the press. After the movie exploded into a box office phenomenon, journalists were desperate for behind-the-scenes stories. They dug into every scrap of drama they could find, and the Shaw-Dreyfuss conflict gave them exactly what they needed: two strong personalities, unpredictable outbursts, and a toxic undercurrent that could be shaped into a perfect Hollywood narrative. Reporters framed Shaw as the boozy, brilliant old-school actor, and Dreyfuss as the brash, thin-skinned newcomer. Each interview they gave was dissected for hidden jabs or unresolved bitterness. The feud, real or not, made for better copy than any technical hiccup or production mishap. But the most unexpected revival of the feud came decades later, in the form of a stage play. In 2019, The Shark is Broken premiered at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. Co-written by Ian Shaw, Robert Shaw's son, it reimagined the tense, confined reality of the Orca set as a character drama. Ian played his own father, portraying Shaw as a brilliant but broken man haunted by fame, aging, and his own destructive habits. The play leans heavily into the idea of the feud as real, giving audiences a front-row seat to the verbal sparring, jealousy, and deep psychological wounds that supposedly unfolded during the shoot. The play was a hit. It moved to the West End, then Broadway. Audiences were fascinated not just by the story, but by the idea that the feud was more than just a footnote. For many, it was the emotional engine behind Jaws. The tension between Quint and Hooper, once seen as pure acting, was now interpreted as an echo of real pain. The play made people question everything. Were the actors channeling their characters, or were the characters simply reflections of the actors themselves? Dreyfuss, for his part, was not pleased. He publicly criticized the play, saying it hurt him to see that version of Shaw immortalized. He claimed it was fiction disguised as truth, an exaggeration that reduced a complicated man to a caricature. And yet, his protests only reignited interest in the feud. Fans began digging deeper, pulling old quotes, comparing timelines, trying to solve a mystery that still refuses to be pinned down. The more Dreyfuss tried to bury the story, the more powerful it seemed to become. By the time Jaws hit theaters in the summer of 1975, audiences had no idea the storm that had raged behind the scenes. What they saw on screen was unforgettable. A gritty, suspenseful masterpiece that redefined what a summer blockbuster could be. But for those who knew the truth, the magic came at a cost. And oddly enough, it was that very friction, the infamous Dreyfuss-Shaw feud, that may have elevated the film from good to legendary. The dynamic between Hooper and Quint is electric. Their arguments are sharp, their distrust is palpable, and their eventual cooperation feels hard-won. That realism did not come from rehearsals. It came from something deeper, something raw. Robert Shaw did not have to pretend to be annoyed by Dreyfuss, and Dreyfuss did not have to dig for discomfort during their scenes together. It was already there, baked into their every interaction. One of the most iconic moments in the film, the Indianapolis speech, was performed by Shaw in a near trance. He delivered it late into production after several failed attempts, some derailed by alcohol. But when he finally nailed it, the atmosphere on set reportedly shifted. Everyone felt it. That speech, full of quiet terror and haunted memory, was not just acting. It was Robert Shaw reaching into something real. Dreyfuss, standing opposite him, was visibly shaken. That scene captured more than a monologue. It captured a collision of two actors on opposite ends of a war, on screen and off. Even Steven Spielberg, in later interviews, admitted he benefited from the chaos. The mechanical shark barely worked, which meant the film leaned more on its actors to create suspense. And what better tool than real human tension? Spielberg never encouraged the feud, but he certainly used it. He once joked that he finished Jaws with fewer friends than he started with, but a much better film. For Dreyfuss, the experience was both career-defining and emotionally scarring. He emerged from Jaws with fame, accolades, and a newfound reputation. But he also carried the burden of being remembered less for his performance and more for his conflict with Shaw. Over the years, he has spoken about how exhausting it is to constantly answer questions about a feud he insists never truly existed. At times, his tone shifts, part defense, part exhaustion, part sadness. It is clear that something about those months at sea stuck with him. Shaw, on the other hand, never got the chance to tell his side. He died in 1978 at the age of 51, leaving behind a complicated legacy. Those who knew him described him as brilliant, self-destructive, poetic, and intimidating. His career was full of unforgettable roles, but Jaws was arguably the one that left the biggest mark. And yet, it is often filtered through the lens of the feud. The lasting irony? The very tension that made Jaws a masterpiece also cast a long shadow over both men's lives. It became the story behind the story, the unscripted drama that shaped the scripted one. And decades later, people are still trying to piece together what was real, what was performance, and what it all meant. Nearly 50 years have passed since Jaws changed the landscape of modern cinema. Its shark may have been the monster on screen, but off-screen, a different kind of beast took shape, one built of memory, bitterness, and unresolved tension. The feud between Richard Dreyfuss and Robert Shaw has become more than a behind-the-scenes anecdote. It has become folklore, and like all great folklore, it is messy, contradictory, and impossible to fully pin down. So what does the Dreyfuss-Shaw conflict actually reveal? First, it exposes something Hollywood often hides, that great art is not always born in harmony. Sometimes, greatness comes from discomfort, from conflict, from two forces that cannot coexist, and yet must. Shaw and Dreyfuss were never meant to be friends. They came from different worlds. Shaw was the grizzled warhorse, steeped in the traditions of theater and tortured by personal demons. Dreyfuss was young, fast-rising, impatient, and unafraid to push back. On paper, they were a disaster waiting to happen. On screen, they were lightning in a bottle. Their feud tells a second story, about control. Shaw often battled his own impulses. His drinking, by all accounts, was both a symptom and a spark. Dreyfuss, meanwhile, struggled with anxiety, pressure, and a need to prove himself. Neither man had full control of the chaos around them, and their reactions to that chaos clashed violently. But beneath the jabs and rumors, there may have been something neither ever admitted outright, a strange kind of respect. Ian Shaw, Robert's son, hinted at this in interviews tied to The Shark is Broken. He believes his father saw something in Dreyfuss, something familiar, maybe even threatening, the hunger, the intelligence, the vulnerability. And Dreyfuss, in turn, saw in Shaw not just a bully, but a man falling apart in slow motion, brilliant and deeply sad. When Dreyfuss now says he loved Shaw, perhaps he means it not as a denial of the feud, but as an acknowledgement that human relationships are rarely clean-cut. They are sharp-edged, blurred by time, and shaped by the silence left when one party is no longer here to speak for themselves. There is a third truth, too, about legacy. Shaw died young, never witnessing the full cultural impact of Jaws, nor the way his own legend would grow. Dreyfuss lived to see it all, the retrospectives, the reissues, the Broadway play, the podcasts and articles that bring up the feud in every interview, and it clearly frustrates him. There was no feud, he insists. It's just a story. But in the end, that is what Jaws was, a story, one about a man, a shark, and survival. The Dreyfuss-Shaw feud is just another layer to that narrative, another myth woven into the fabric of Hollywood's greatest myths. True or not, it tells us something essential about performance, ego, pain, and the mysterious alchemy of filmmaking. Maybe that is why the story still matters. Because some legends do not fade. They circle beneath the surface, waiting to be rediscovered. Like the shark itself, they never really leave.